In this video, we'll be looking at how to set up this panoramic curved 3D slider in Bricks Builder. This was based on a request from a member of the Bricks Builder community, Timo Funfout. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. Thanks also to Abdul Wahid for bringing this to my attention. It was quite an interesting challenge. After a few hours of research and vibe coding, I arrived at this result. You can see it not only plays nicely with other elements in this section, but is also fully responsive from mobile to ultra-wide screens. For this to be possible, we'll need GSAP, the GSAP Draggable extension, which is optional, then of course JavaScript and CSS. I've also taken additional steps to make the code very easy to customize so you can adapt it to your requirements. Let's get into it. The first thing we're going to do is to embed the GSAP library onto the head of this page. And because I do not need the library across the whole website, I can get away with embedding it only on this page. So I'll go into the page settings and paste the embed code into the header scripts text area. Next, we'll build out the basic structure of the hero section. I'll add a new section, then paste the hero content block, which I'll place inside the container. With the container selected, I'll make some visual adjustments to center the whole thing. Then I'll paste in another container, which will contain the three main benefits. To speed things up, I'll do the layout with CSS classes. So I'll add grid 3, grid M1 for responsiveness, and finally content gap. To keep things organized, I'm going to name the containers content box and hero benefits respectively. Now we're going to add one more container between content box and hero benefits. I must add that the reason for going through the trouble of setting up the entire section is because in the real world, the slider isn't going to exist in a vacuum. You obviously need to place it among other elements on your page. And there are a few things to bear in mind regarding how it will interact with the other elements on the page. I'll go ahead now and add 4 more elements. And you need to follow this exact structure. Now we'll name the elements. I'll name the container curved carousel. The others I'll name stage, ring, slide, and media respectively. Then I'll use the BEM tool, which is a feature of automatic CSS, to quickly generate the classes. You can manually name your classes accordingly if you don't have the ACSS plugin. I also want to add the ls prefix to the class name just to avoid conflicts wherever this template might be used. Now we have all the classes assigned. Something to keep in mind about the structure is that if we are going to use static images, you want to duplicate the slides for as many times as you need. Then add your images. Or like in this case, since I like to keep things simple, I'll select the slide and apply a query loop so it pulls data from one of my custom post types. Next, I'll make sure to point the media to pull in the featured image. Finally, I'll select the curved carousel and add a code element. We'll clear the defaults and prepare to add our custom code. I'll go ahead and paste the CSS and JavaScript. Execute code and render without wrapper. Straight away, you should see that the layout of the images change. More on that shortly. But let's save and preview. If it all checks out, we should already have the slider running. You might observe some strange effects on the vertical and horizontal scroll bars of the page. To fix this, you want to set the parent section's overflow to hidden or clip. Now the overflow issues should be fixed. Now let's take a closer look at the CSS. If you haven't already, check out my multi-level header menu template for Bricks Builder. It's designed to provide a robust starting point in creating a simple yet powerful header menu relatively quickly. The template also includes a CSS style sheet where I've curated all the most important styling options in one place, so you don't have to go hunting around the Bricks user interface to have a header menu that looks and feels exactly how you would want. My favorite feature by far is that it offers a true multi-level experience on mobile, making content easily accessible without overwhelming your users. Plus, you can replace the boring old toggle icon with something more delightful. You can purchase the multi-level header template at the link in the description below. Let's get back to it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. We have a lot of interesting things going on here. And the first thing I want to point out is how I've prefixed some of the selectors in the CSS with this body.bricks front-end selector. The purpose is to limit some of the CSS rules to the front end only. You see, the slider relies on absolute positioning and then the JavaScript, which helps it to display properly. But due to performance reasons, JavaScript doesn't run in the builder, so we'll be left with a messy backend. You can see a bit of that mess when I remove the selector from the slide's CSS rule. Remember, in a real-life scenario, we still intend to build the rest of the page, and we can't have the one slide turning the builder into a mess of puzzle pieces. We still have enough of its styles coming through to give you a rough layout of your slider. Now, to the custom properties. Before anything, I have to mention the fade out feature. I've left a comment here to remind you of this feature. You can make the edges of the slider fade out by adding a class named fadeout to the curved carousel. To do that, simply select the curved carousel. Make sure you are on the ID level and in the CSS classes field, type fadeout, and you should see the change immediately. And it's not just an overlay, but true fade out, which you can see when I change the background. Here's the effect on the front end. Now let's look at the other controls available to us in the CSS. So I've isolated the three main controls, namely the viewport height, perspective, and block offset. Now about the viewport height, this controls the height of the slider container ls curved carousel. Here's an example of how this can be useful. So far, it looks nice at these viewport dimensions, but what happens when we switch to an ultra-wide screen? You can see that there's a visible crop at the top and bottom due to the carousel height. While this should not be a problem since the container's overflow property was already set to visible, remember we added the fadeout class which uses a CSS mask. This mask sets a hard limit to the bounds of the container. When I remove the class, the limit goes away. So I suppose you have to pick your battles, remove the fadeout and not worry about the cutout, or beat it until it submits. Guess which one we're picking? Let's adjust the viewport height to around 70 rem, which is just enough room for the slides to show without getting cropped. And this brings a new problem where the containers above and below get pushed further away, leaving us with this open space. This is where the block offset comes in. But before we go there, let's have a look at the mobile view. We can also adjust the height on mobile devices with the viewport height M variable if necessary. I'll leave it as it is for now as we look at the block offset. The block offset is one way to work around the excess space caused by the height increase. The block offset basically adds a negative margin to the top and bottom of the slide, forcing the other containers to overlap the carousel. So I'll set it to a negative value around minus 18 rem, and you see it pulls the siblings closer. For mobile, we can also set the block offset to minus 6 rem, and everything should look fine now. You can also use clamp functions or ACSS spacing variables like section space XXL to get fluid responsive spacing, removing the need even for the mobile value. So you can experiment with that if you know what you're doing. One more thing to talk about here is the perspective control. The perspective property controls how far away on the z-axis the object seems from the screen. So if I set it to 1000 pixels, we observe less of the perspective distortion that gave us the curve. So the higher the value, the flatter the slider looks. So I set it to 600 by default. It's like the difference between an 85mm lens and a 16mm wide-angle lens. I also provided a property for mobile because when we crop to mobile breakpoint, all we see is the center portion of the screen, which makes it look flat. So we have to increase the perspective even further to retain that distorted look. Look what happens if we set it to 600 pixels. Then something like 350 pixels. So somewhere around 400 to 300 works nicely for mobile devices. You might also notice the wider gap between the slides on mobile. And again, that is caused by a combination of the cropping effect that switching to mobile breakpoints usually has on things like this, and the perspective setting. But we'll fix that when we get to the JavaScript settings. In the meantime, I'll head back to Bricks and apply these settings. Like the CSS code, the JavaScript gives us a number of options that we can use to customize the appearance and behavior of the slider. So if, for example, I set the slide height to 400, you can see the difference on the front-end page. I'll revert that. Next, I'll change the number of slides in Ring to something a lot less, like 6. And you can see how the slides automatically stretch to fill the space since they are so few. This gives us that sci-fi spaceship dashboard look. I'll revert the value to 17. Now, remember what I said about the between slides in mobile breakpoints. We seem to have more space between the slides because we cropped to a closer point of view, and the perspective distortion has been further emphasized by the value of perspective M. But we can correct this by introducing more slides to the system. So I'll set that to 21. You might notice that I've been using odd numbers, and the reason for that is so we always have that one slide in the middle of the screen that isn't at all distorted. I think it further enhances the overall look. Now you see at 21 slides, the gap isn't so wide anymore. Even in desktop view, the spacing is just as consistent. Next is the slide spacing. And as the name implies, we can use this option to control the gap between the slides. So if I set this to 5, you can see that the slides readily squish themselves to mind the gap. I'll revert the value to 1 and we can look at the radius. The radius controls the size of the ring. So if I set it to a higher value like 1800, you can see how it changes the look of the slider. This is because the ring is physically larger and the slides have to increase their width to make up for the extra space. To further illustrate, I'll set the value to something a lot smaller, like 600, and you can almost see the walls of the slider ring. Feel free to play around with these values till you can get something you like. I'll revert the radius to 1200 since I found that to be a sweet spot. Initial rotation basically determines the point from which the carousel begins its rotation. When I refresh the page, notice that you'll always find the brown photo at the middle. But if we change the initial rotation to 90 degrees, the brown image no longer starts at the middle. This can be useful if you're trying to have a slider with team members, for example, and you like to have the team leader's photo start at the middle. This can help you achieve that. One interesting thing I must mention about the carousel is that it prioritizes the seamlessness of the loop regardless of the number of slides in the carousel. This means it intelligently duplicates the slides and adjusts their widths so that we always have just enough to make a seamless loop. So, for example, I've used a query loop to populate the slides, which gives me 9 posts to work with. Imagine I limit that to only 4 posts or slides. You can see that all 4 images simply get duplicated until we have enough to meet that 21 slide mark. Next, we have the animation settings. You can turn off auto rotate by setting it to false, and this should simply turn off the auto rotation, so the result is just a static set of images. The rotation speed is a very sensitive value which determines the degrees of rotation per frames. You see that just increasing it from 0.1 to 0.4 increases the speed noticeably. The rotation direction simply determines whether it should rotate clockwise or counterclockwise. Next, we have the interaction settings, which consist of pause on hover and resume delay. Between these two options, you can choose whether the slider stops when you mouse over and how long it takes to resume on mouse out. I'll set the resume delay to 2000 milliseconds and pause on hover to true. At the front end, you can see it stops when I hover and takes the next 2 seconds to resume on mouse out. You can also turn off the delay by setting the resume delay to 0 so it resumes instantly. I'll revert all that and we'll move on to the next option, which is just as interesting: entrance animations. The first option allows us to enable or disable the animation altogether, although I think this is quite redundant, so by the time you watch this video, I'd have updated the code to remove this option. We'll simply control the whole thing by setting the entrance type to none, fade in or fade up. So if I fade in, you can see how the slides all across the ring fade in. If we set it to fade up, the slides fly up all around. Note that these options are case sensitive. We also have the other options which are quite self-explanatory. I won't be going into further details in this video. I'm sure you can agree to the endless possibilities available to us with this slider. At this point, we'll talk about the draggable functionality. I made a different version of the JavaScript that includes draggable because it requires you to import an additional JavaScript library, the GSAP draggable plugin. And because it isn't required to make the carousel work, we can do without it for the most part and keep things simple. It's pretty light and very performant as with all things GSAP. So, like before, I'll paste the code in the head to import the draggable plugin. Then replace the JavaScript with the version with the draggable functionality. The only difference between this script and the previous one is that it includes settings for the draggable feature. So we can toggle draggable, adjust the sensitivity, and invert the direction of drag. Here's how it works on the page. As soon as the slider kicks off, you see our mouse pointer changes to the hand icon, ready to drag the carousel. And you see that when I drag to the right, it flows left. We can change that behavior by setting invert drag option to false. While we're still here, I'll reduce the sensitivity to 0.2 and save. Now, when I drag, it feels more natural and works as expected. I hope you found this video helpful. You can find the necessary code snippets on my website, linked in the description below. While I have the regular version freely available on my website, I also have the draggable version of the code available on my template store. It includes the ready-to-use bricks template, which you can import along with the 2 versions of the code snippet. If you found this video helpful and would like to support the channel, consider purchasing the template. Feel free to use the comments for any questions you might have, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe if you haven't. I'll see you in the next one.